This chapter is about the beginning of the War of Brittany's succession and preparation of a new campaign of Edward III. Stay tuned. When Edward III was raising money to form a new army to renew the war with France, which would happen in 1346, riots broke up in Brittany, which England could not ignore. Brittany was a strategically important area for the English because merchant ships constantly transported grain between England and Bordeaux along its coast, delivering grain to Aquitaine and returning with wine. In addition, in the event of a storm in the Bay of Biscay on the way to the Aquitaine in Brittany, it was possible to wait out the weather. For England, it was important that Brittany at best be an ally and at worst be neutral. Although the Dukes of Brittany were considered vassals of the French king, they minted their own money, and upon taking office they arranged a magnificent ceremony similar to the coronation. They always tried to be independent from the French crown, and they succeeded in one way or another. It all depended on what kind of control the successive French kings were able to establish over the distant province. It happened that the Bretons, dissatisfied with the Duke's rule, filed complaints to the Parliament, located in Paris, but the decisions taken by this instance were ignored by the Breton dukes, and even the king was almost helpless. Duke Arthur II of Brittany, who ruled from 1305 to 1312, was married twice. From his first marriage with Marie, Viscountess of Limoges, he had two sons, John III, who succeeded him in 1312, and Guy, who died in 1331. From the second wife of Yolande, Countess of Montfort, he had one son, John de Morfont. Duke John III died in 1341 without leaving an heir. Guy, who had died earlier, had a daughter, Joanna de Benfevre. John de Montfort, even before the death of Duke John III, spent a lot of time in the French capital trying to prove his hereditary rights to some estates in court, and also visited Flanders, where he married the daughter of the Count, the ruler of this region. When the Duke John died in 1341, Jean de Montfort considered himself the successor of the Duke, and he found a strong rival, Joanna of Benfevre. Then John de Montfort turned to Edward III to assistance, believing that since Edward had declared himself a French monarch, he could decide the issue in his favor. Meanwhile, the assembly convened in Paris by Philip VI resolved the Brittany inheritance dispute in favor of Joan of Benfevre, which is not surprising. She was the wife of Charles Blois, a loyal supporter of the king. Contributing to this decision of the assembly, Philip deliberately did not take into account the fact that only a few years ago he categorically asserted inheritance of a throne on the female side was unacceptable. Otherwise, this judgment would have extended to the duchy. When John de Montfort decided to defend his right by force, but he did not find much support among the population. However, when Charles Blois at the head of a French army invaded Brittany, the situation changed. The Bretons divided into varying camps. The high nobility took the side of Charles, and the small nobility who spoke Breton were outraged by the attempt on their independence and began to support de Montfort. This party was joined by merchants and coastal dwellers who lived on outcome from stable trade with England. However, the Montforts failed the attempts to resist the enemy. Brittany was invaded by a French army under the command of John, Duke of Normandy, son of Philip. First, John captured Champtocé on Loire, then besieged and took Nantes on November 18th. In the battle, Jean de Montfort was captured. Negotiations began. What can de Montfort consider compensation for giving up the power in Brittany? But the anti-French party had its own views on who should have the power in the duchy and continued its armed struggle against the enemy. The efforts of the Montfort supporters were unsuccessful. In spring on 1342, John took Rennes and then won in the battle. But when it seems that de Montfort's party was irrevocably defeated, his wife Joan of Flanders, a resolved woman with the heart of a lion and the inflexibility of a man, as the Chronicle Froissart described her, went to England and persuaded Edward III, who did not need much persuasion, sent the English army to Brittany. In March 1342, Sir Barthelmeny disembarked in Brittany 40 knights and 200 archers. He was followed by William Bohun, Earl of Northampton, in July of that year, who had 50 knights and 1,000 archers in his army. Landing in Brittany, Northampton added Walter Manny's soldiers to his army, assumed command of the combined forces, and laid siege to the city of Marly. In September, the French army under the command of Charles Blois came to the aid of the besieged city. Then Northampton at night withdrew with his army 4 miles northwest of Marly and took up a defensive position. The rear of Northampton was covered by a dense forest, and the flanks were only copses, and therefore Northampton ordered to dig ditches in front of them. But he didn't stop there. Using to his advantage the sad experience gained by the English in the Battle of Bannockburn, he also ordered to dig ditches and holes before the front, and then cover them with branches and grass. Before the battle, Northampton dismounted all of his soldiers in his army and stretched the front. In contrast to what would come to the standard of English defensive tactics in the future, Northampton did not put archers on the flanks, but included them in the general frontal formation, apparently fearing that otherwise the depth of the line would be insufficient. Northampton could line up his army in 2 lines with a depth and width of 600 yards, but due to the fact that most of the troops were archers, unlike knights that did not have, as you might assume, weapons such as sword, maces and halberds, it is more likely that he built an army in 3 or 4 rows, with a width of 300 to 400 yards. Anyway, when on September the 3rd the 5,000 French army charged with the heavy cavalry in front, and the French knights did not notice the obstacles and fell with their horses, and the foot Englishmen easily dealt with them. In this battle the French lost at least 50 knights killed, and about 150 more were captured. The rest of the French fled from the battlefield. Lacking sufficient strength, Northampton didn't pursue them. In October, Edward III joined Northampton, who landed in Brest in 5,000-strong army, and soon the Anglo-Breton took all coastal cities in Brittany. John, Duke of Normandy, also wasn't left without reinforcement after Philip VI brought his army to Brittany. However, the French preferred defensive tactics, not thinking of giving the enemy decisive battle. They thought it would be wiser to wait until the English king ran out of money to support the army, or he made a mistake that would allow them to defeat him. The French allowed Edward to take one, which however English managed to do in several attempts. In one of the attacks led by Robert Artois he was injured, then as if recovering he contracted dysentery and died.
When he seemed about to recover, suddenly felt the icy hand of death upon him.
His body was taken to England and buried in London. One became the Anglo-Breton administrative center, but further unfortunately for the supporters of de Montfort, things stuck. There was a lull in the confrontation between the parties, and finally in January 1343 a truce was concluded, which fixed the situation that existed at the moment. Further peace negotiations would begin on a more productive basis only with the mediation of the Pope. John de Montfort escaped from prison, breaking his word not to try to escape, given by him for his relative freedom, came to England and made a homage to Edward III as the French king. In 1445, John de Montfort returned to Brittany, intending to continue the struggle for hereditary rights, but in September he suddenly died from blood poisoning, neglecting the small wound. De Montfort's party now had to align their future plans with the 5-year-old son. The war in Britain nevertheless brought the English noticeable success. They received a good bridgehead for further military operation in France, and Edward began to prepare for a renewed war with France. One of the tasks that should be solved was the food supply on the army. It was believed that after the landing of the troops on the continent, after some time, food products could be purchased from allies, but it was necessary to feed the army before that, at gathering points at the sea and at least first time on the continent. It was believed that the quartermasters would purchase the necessary amount of food and deliver to gathering points and loading ports. In those days the soldiers' diet included salted beef and pork, bacon and lamb, dried fish, usually herring, wheat and rye flour, oats, peas and beans, and even cheese, usually brought in the weight of whey, 26 stones or 165 kilos. Potato then of course did not exist, and the main food in the medieval man was bread, with the exception of rich people. When eating, a large piece of bread was used as a present plate. Wheat grew only on rich lands, and white bread in the army was intended only for commanders. The rest ate rye. In those days the water was dirty, it contained all kinds of diseases, thus they drank water only as a last resort. They drank mostly ale from the barley. The barley was soaked until they spouted and gave malt, which was dried, threshed and mixed with the warm water, which caused fermentation. The result was a low-alcohol drink that did not cause drunkenness. Soldiers were given 1 gallon or 378 liters of ale a day. Many Englishmen made ale at home, and even women were allowed to brew, but only a few supplied beer to the army. When in 1340 Yarmouth brewers contracted to supply ale for 1,510 people, the crew of 30 ships scheduled to sail from England to Flanders and back in 40 days, the three producers supplied 60,400 gallons, like 228,638 liters of ale to the navy at a price of 1 penny for a gallon. From the end of 1345 to the spring of 1336, English soldiers by the order followed to the gathering points and from there to the ports of loading, and the royal surgeons requisitioned ships and prepared for the transport of troops to France. Their owners and merchants treated the requisition of ships as negatively as possible. After all, trade was disrupted. The requisition and the process of preparing the ship for sales took a lot of time. First, it was required to unload the ships, often not at the port of destination. Then bring it to Portsmouth, Sandwich or Winchelsea. Prepare troops and horses for loading, then load the necessary equipment and food. The ships on which it was supported to transport horses would have been equipped with wide ladders, and stalls should be installed on board. Preparing to sail, the English in Hampshire alone ordered 20 such ladders and 1,000 portable fences for the construction of stalls, as well as in the right amount of nails, rings to tie horses, and belts for the reins. The soldiers recruited by recruiting commissions were from Cintra-Trent, the country south of the Trent River. The population of the northern territories at that time was not subject to recruitment, for there was still a threat of Scottish aggression. The soldiers gathered at the gathering points of their county, and when there were enough of them to assign a commander, they were sent to port of destination. On January 2, 1346, 30 soldiers from Salisbury, having been ordered to go to Sandwich, covered 130 miles in 6 days. Soldiers from Stafford, assigned to same port, covered 140 miles in 7 days. And soldiers recruited in Shaftesbury marched 155 miles to Winchelsea, taking 12 days. The soldiers had to walk on bad roads and cover considerable distances every day with weapons and knapsacks. When the recruited soldiers waited at the gathering place and then set off, they were supported by the king all this time. Sometimes the soldiers out of gathering points had to stay for a long time to wait for the rest of the recruits, or to wait out the bad weather, which pleased the local ladies of easy virtue and the owners of taverns, but most likely it was not particularly liked by other local residents. The size of the army recruited by Edward in 1346 is not known for certain. The necessary official documents, for example payrolls, have not reached our time, and the authors of a chronicle seems to have taken random data, usually in accordance with their own ideas. The most reliable source indicated that English army included 16,500 soldiers, in addition to trumpeters, standard bearers, healers, demolitionists, blacksmiths, sharpshooters, artisans, as well as a separately listed Bishop of Durham, whose salary was 6 shillings 8 pence, like 0.33 pounds. A part of the army in this amount of 7,700 was made up of soldiers from various kinds of suits, bound by feudal or contractual obligations, as well as mercenaries. The other part of the army in the amount of 8,600 people were soldiers recruited by recruitment commissions. The army consisted of 8 earls, 55 bannerets, 599 knights, and 121 squires, but not all of them were officers, otherwise the commanders would have been in overabundance. In fact, the ratio of number of officers to number of ordinary soldiers was about the same as in our time. By specialization, the army consisted of 2,500 armed horsemen and 2,200 horse archers. Soldiers belonged to the various retinues of mercenaries, as well as 500 foot archers, 3,000 Welsh spearmen, and 1,200 hobilars, all recruited by recruiting commissions. Every Welsh Vintinarius had an interpreter, as did other commanders who did not speak English. If we assume that during the battle with the enemy armed horsemen would fight on foot, the only earls and bannerets will ride in order to observe the vicissitudes of a battle, then the English army could put about 8,000 foot soldiers and about the same number of archers on the battlefield, including the Cheshire sharpshooters, the king's bodyguard. Edward III ordered all ships located on Portsmouth and other ports of loading to be ready to sail on February 14, 1346. However, the departure was postponed several times, first due to unavailability of the ships and then due to the unfavorable weather, the storm had begun, and finally the departure was gradually postponed to early July. At the end of July, the weather improved and horses, about 20,000, were loaded on ships and cargo was loaded. In the event of a loss of a horse in the battle, the king was obliged to provide owner with another horse, or to compensate the loss with money. Each horse had a document with a description, indicated the height in withers, and special features which indicate the owner's name and value. The cost of a horse varied from £1 of Hobilar riding horse to £10 of an English knight's war horse. Before sailing to the church of Fareham in Hampshire, a solemn ceremony of handing over the Great Seal of the realm took place, and on July the 5th the English ship sailed to the sea, each from its port of loading, together for the farther journey off the Isle of Wight. When the ships arrived at gathering place, messengers were sent to London, Dover, Winchelsea and Sandwich to convey the king's order not to let anyone out of the country in the next 8 days. The English feared French spies who might inform French of Edward's departure. Edward was about to become one of the greatest generals in English history. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much. Like it if you do, subscribe if you don't want to miss more. Next video will be about Jeanne de Clisson, the woman, knight and pirate. So stay tuned. See you. Bye bye.